Now let's delve in greater detail into the so-called German question. In the Potsdam Conference of 1945, Germany's territory is essentially reshaped. And what are the key features? There's a return to the 1937 borders before the aggressive moves towards Czechoslovakia and Poland. Germany is being divided into 4 occupation zones. Red Army is in control of East Germany. There is a ban for any kind of rearmament, and the 3 Ds proliferate: denazification, decartelization, democratization. And let me give you here a visual output of what do we mean by the partition of Germany. Well, that's how Germany looks from 1945 onwards. We have a British zone of occupation, a French, an American, and a Russian zone of occupation. And gradually over time, after 1945, this consolidates into the Federal Republic of Germany, as the Americans, the French, and the British kind of recede. A group of politicians, there's a new political elite, German political elite, that takes up the project of denazification and introduces effectively a federal liberal democratic political regime, and this is the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic is effectively under Soviet influence. So the borders of the Cold War in Central Europe lie in Germany, and specifically in Berlin. Berlin, and look at this map, it's quite interesting, becomes this weird island, if you will, that is in itself divided between East and West. And here I'm showing you the also it's interesting to get a sense of the national symbols: the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic. Berlin becomes the Cold War city, with checkpoints, with there's so many things going on in Berlin at the time. What's interesting to note is that the Berlin Wall, sometimes we think that it's built right at the time of the division in the 1940s. It's not. It's actually built in 1961, a bit further than the end of the Second World War. And it is built in an attempt to, as it were, thwart the pouring of Germans, the defection of Germans from the socialist part of Berlin to Western Germany. And before the building of the Berlin Wall, approximately 3.5 million Germans left from the socialist Eastern Germany to move on to Western Germany. And actually, it's quite interesting, you can see it in films or documentaries of the period. It wasn't that difficult to escape Eastern Berlin and move on to Western Berlin prior to the existence of the wall. There were guards, for instance, in train stations, etc. But you could get on a train and then get off in a section of Western Berlin. Anyway, let me go back now to the broader picture. Cold War and geopolitics. I would ask you if you were in class, but what are these symbols about? And I would assume you would told me straight away, well, this is the symbol of NATO. What is NATO? NATO comes into existence in 1949. It is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It features 12 countries: the US, Britain, France, Italy, Canada, and so on. And effectively, it is a defense pact. It forms a defense pact for Western Europe. because we have to remember that at the time we are in a kind of bipolar world. The US and the US led Atlantic world on the one end, and the Russian led world on the other end. And these camps need to have strategic and military alliances. And NATO plays this role. It's quite interesting to note that there's a lot of discussion about what is the role of NATO, especially after 1990s, because after the end of the Cold War. And nonetheless, NATO has succeeded in maintaining itself in one way or another. And even some scholars claim today that we may be today in a situation where some kind of another Cold War is taking place if one thinks of the role that NATO plays now in including countries that right now at this time, like Ukraine, etc., are within the boundaries of what Russia is. But this is a subject for another discussion. The antagonist, if you will, to NATO is the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact is a similar effort from the socialist world to create a strategic defensive alliance. The core member states of the Warsaw Pact are Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and the German Democratic Republic. It is a military alliance, and it forces a centralized policy on its member states. And this is pretty much how the borders of the new Cold War are shaped. What do we have here? We have in orange the states that belong to the Warsaw Pact. In green, member states of NATO. And here what's interesting to note, see, Greece becomes a member of NATO, especially after the end of after the end of the Civil War, where the Western forces prevail. Turkey becomes a member of NATO, and again, that pertains to the fact that Germany has borders with Russia. And what's interesting to note here as well is that there's a number of countries that are non-aligned, that they're not really committing to either alliance. And what's interesting in this non-aligned, that one of the interesting non-aligned countries is Yugoslavia, who in fact, as we shall see, has a socialist regime. I should here bring in again the big picture and mention that there is no scholarly agreement on the responsibility for the division of Europe, which Camp started it first, as it were. The post-war peace transition in Europe was influenced by the war achievements. This is important to realize. The Red Army conquered vast territories which Stalin's USSR claimed as its spheres of influence. And in many places, the Soviet occupiers were initially welcomed as liberators who brought change and reform. This is something we need to bear in mind. It's not that as simple as people thinking that, the Russians in certain places were thought of in as bad terms as the Nazis. No, they were seen as liberators initially. The USSR also sought to control over new states in Eastern Europe. But the problem sometimes is that the local political leaders in the places in Eastern Europe where Russia had its grip didn't quite, they were not really believed. In many cases, there were leaders coming from Russia into these places. What happened with Hitler's former allies? Many countries in Eastern Europe were occupied and allied with the Nazis, as I explained also last week. In 1946-47, communist parties started adopting a more aggressive approach towards their opponents, and sometimes they used violence. And here I want to zoom in 3 different countries and explain briefly 3 different regimes that we have in Eastern Europe. Poland. Despite its opposition to Hitler, Poland was targeted by the USSR like no other Eastern European pro-Nazi state. Communism was in a minority in Poland. However, Poland had this great strategic value for the USSR. And for some, the USSR seemed to be protecting Poland from risk of a German or some kind of German return. Remember the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that we talked about a few weeks ago, and how in 1939 there's this secret agreement of a division in spheres of influence of Poland. So for Russia, Poland was a strategic domain, and Russia made sure that after the end of the Second World War, that Poland would remain in its orbit. Now, it's questionable to what extent did the Polish people embrace socialism. The second interesting case is Czechoslovakia. And again, remember 1938, the Munich Agreement that stipulates effectively the de facto end of the state, and then the Germans take over the whole of Czechoslovakia. The Czechs welcomed the Soviets as liberators. The Czechs always had the upper hand in Czechoslovakia, by the way. In 1946, the Communist Party there won 40% of the vote in Czechoslovakia. In 1947, the Czechs followed Russian guidance and declined the Marshall Aid Plan for the reconstruction of Europe, and I will refer to the Marshall Aid Plan and this aspect of the reconstruction of Europe in the next lecture. Broadly speaking, the Russian rule, the socialist rule in Czechoslovakia, seemed to be on a better footing than in Poland. However, as we shall see later on in 1968, things turned sour. Now, Yugoslavia. Remember earlier, right? Yugoslavia was a non-aligned nation. However, Yugoslavia was a regime that was consolidated on socialist principles after the Second World War. Yugoslav communist partisans fought against the Nazis with American financial support. They enjoyed popular support after the war, and the leader, the father of Yugoslavia, the post-war father of Yugoslavia, is the person in the picture, the Josip Broz Tito. Tito was, however, formed his own model of communism in competition with the USSR. He did support the insurgents in the Greek Civil War, and he was a somewhat too ambitious and provocative leader for Stalin. And there were many frictions between Yugoslavia and the USSR. Tito, in other words, didn't toe the line of what the socialist states ought to be doing. And that's why Yugoslavia as a regime had a relative autonomy in its standing over in the world. It wasn't quite aligning with what the socialist bloc was about. Now, I should end this here, and in the next segment, I will offer an overview. I will move on from division to unity, talk about the foundations of the UN, other structures that come in the 40s and early 50s, and I will end with a discussion on another facet of this period, and this is the period of the atomic age, the atomic threat.